Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome back to our show director Denis Villeneuve, as well as the sound team behind the extraordinary Dune Part 2. Joining Denis for our conversation today are supervising music editor Clint Bennett, re-recording mixers Ron Bartlett and Doug Hemphill, and the film's supervising sound editor and sound designer Richard King. Denis is rightfully considered one of our premier visual storytellers. His movies feature arresting cinematic images. But did you know that each of his past 4 films, Sicario, Arrival, Blade Runner 2049, and Dune Part 1, have all been either nominated or won Oscars for sound? That's a remarkable run, and that consistent recognition is a testament to his ability to collaborate closely with the sound team to ensure that every detail enhances the story's emotional impact. So that's where I started our conversation, by asking Denis about his approach to using sound as a storytelling tool.
First of all, I think that sound is by far, if not the most powerful tool in the cinematic language, meaning that also for the theatrical experience, and something that people can have quite big screens at home, but you will never reproduce the power of sound in it, like in a theater. The amount of air that you have between you and the speakers, and the immersive feeling that you create, and it's a tool that I've been developing through. I started with documentaries, but even back then, it's something that I was really interested by the power of sound and all the creativity behind it. And I've been through studying cinema through the years, where there was a lot of development in new sound system, THX sound system, and etc. And it was really exciting years when you were seeing all these new development, new technologies coming in. And I will say that I'm trying at my best in the past recent years. I did my best to think about the sound in the early development of the screenplay. And it's something that has been going through even in the storyboard process. We make jokes about it, my storyboard artist and I, that he's very clumsy with including sound. There's a limit to drawing, but sorry, I'm just trying to make a joke. It didn't work out. But we are trying I'm trying to think about the narrative through sound as much early as possible. And a thing that I love that I suffered a lot when I was working earlier as an indie filmmaker. I was feeling that sound was coming really at the end of the process, that there was no, and I tried to bring it earlier, even in screenwriting, but even then in prep and as we are doing production, to have a team of artists that start to design sounds to feed the editing room. And it's not a coincidence that Joe Walker, my editor, we became almost married because our a communal love of sound. Joe cut the film, but the image, but there's like the sound philosophy, the philosophy of the sound. Sorry, and we try to create a roadmap for the team that will inspire them and help them to mix the film later. That is something that is embedded in the DNA of the cut, to help to feed my colleagues here. And of course, there will be it will explode after, and they will bring all of their creativity. But there's like a map that because in the editing room, I think that the sound is as important as the image. Well,
Denis, I love the way you talk about that, and it's something that when we're working with young filmmakers, writer, directors, we try to encourage them to think about sound from the very beginning of the process. And I think, that what you just said is fantastic about that. Richard, I'd love for you to kind of jump in maybe now and talk a little bit about your collaboration with Joe Walker through the picture editorial process, and kind of, I know that maybe you came in a little bit later on this film than you typically would have, but I'd love to sort of hear a little bit about that collaboration between you and picture editorial.
I came in early for a spotting session with Denis and Joe, and one of the words that Denis used was he wanted it to sound like a documentary. He wanted the feeling of a documentary, by which I took to mean you don't want to watch the film thinking that a bunch of sound editors are cutting this sound. All the sound was captured on the day out in the desert on Arrakis. all the machinery has to feel believable and feel like it's something you could hear in the world, and not some. Every time any sound became a little too sci-fi, then he would hit the eject button and let me know. Everything had to have a kind of a gritty realness to it. And I've always thought that that was a powerful way to approach sound in cinema, because people recognize when something sounds a little fake or off. And you got to imagine that the laws of physics work the same everywhere, that sound behaves the same, that air has a certain thickness to it, that high frequencies fall off the further away you are from them. And I think that if you try to get in, try to fake things just a little bit, or use sounds that are clearly synthesized sounds, like we tried some synthesized sounds for some of the weapons, and that was Vinny quickly pointed that out and pointed me in a different direction. You want the audience to just accept all these sounds as being there. And I think in that way, sound can be kind of a great secret weapon, because we get away with a lot. The audience just accepts that this is the world. This is the sound of this world. That was our kind of marching orders in the beginning. I would make stuff, send it to Denis and Joe. They would listen. I would get comments and notes and adapt it, modify from there. And it was a continual kind of back and forth process up through and including through the mix.
I have to add that it's what Richard did is truly remarkable for itself. But if you have to add what happens in the kitchen stays in the kitchen. But let's say that for specific reason, Richard came very late in the process. Okay, technically, Richard saved my life, and he came, and I was amazed by how he really got into the mood of the film, and really is a very strong listener. Someone, he was really trying to get what we were trying to achieve, and he really nailed it. And it was a very narrow target, I would say, because he didn't have a lot of time to do a movie of that scale. And I'm still in awe with what Richard brought at that speed to the screen. So it was it was difficult conditions for Richard, I would say.
It was the thrill of a lifetime, and I would have walked through glass to work on this movie. It was a great deal of fun.
Yeah, you said to me something like, I didn't have space to make mistake. I didn't have the choice to succeed.
You talked about the realism and the naturalness of it. One of the scenes that stood out for me was just that very early on in the film, the Fremen ambush on the Harkonnen platoon, that kind of you very, very close to the opening of the film. One of the things that struck me is you're playing so brilliantly with dynamics in the mix. There's so much of that attack scene that is so quiet. And then you've got the contrast with like these thuds as the Harkonnen bodies are falling down, around them. It's just an amazingly crafted sequence. And I would love for you to just talk about sort of crafting that sequence, your approach to the dynamics of it. I mean, one of the things that stood out to me was this sort of a remarkable choice that when the Harkonnens fly, but there's no, there's no sound of that technology as they fly. It's just played in silence, which turns out to be an effectively just creepy and terrifying approach, right? Because you don't know where they're going to be. So I would love for you just to talk about kind of with that first scene, your approach to it and crafting it from a dynamic standpoint.
It's a scene that was meant to be tense, and there's something about quiet things that I'm terrified by. There's something about the absence of sound, or just to hear isolated things and to feel the threat coming just from sound. At the beginning, we hear these voices, and it was like just to have like the when when you have fear and you focus just on your heartbeat, and you're just about your intimate environment. And I was trying to create that tension, that pressure coming out of silence. And it's a thing that I absolutely love with Ron and Doug, how they are masters of those dynamics, how they are not afraid to going in a more pure zone and just suddenly to rise the volume when it's needed, or to increase the amount of effects when it's needed. And it's like we were trying to really nail the idea that this scene will be seen specifically from Paul's perspective, and that he has very little information. And is trying to decipher and to understand how they would be able to survive to the circumstances. So it was like this idea of someone doing almost like scuba diving in the desert and trying to, with as less information as possible, survive.
I mean, Denis hit it on the head. We love doing huge dynamics. We push it as far as we can go, and there's not a lot of directors that allow you to be that bold. And it's the one of many things we love about mixing for Denis is to be able to go there and do that kind of thing. And we bring it way down to where you can just barely hear any wind at all, and maybe a footstep, and then all hell breaks loose. And it's just such a great way to be impactful with the story, but it allows you don't have to be as loud and in your face that way, but the dynamics allow you to get the impact of that. So it's an excellent tool for a story as well. And it's just fun to do it. It's like it really makes you lean into the story, and everybody's kind of like, what's going to happen? And it builds that tension without doing anything, and then hits you on the head and knocks you back in your seat. And it's just a fun ride.
One of the things that struck me was, Denis, the way you approached the design of the Fremen spaces. They're strongholds, these places they're all stone, and sometimes a lot of water. I think, visually, I realized the second or third time I watched the movie, I would expect them to be very reverberant audio spaces, but you went a very different direction. They're actually very, very quiet.
We had discussion with Ron and Doug about that, about the impact of the sound. And there's something about Patrice's design that it's like temple, and they are so. My theory was that they were so huge that the sound was not traveling. A bit like when you enter a church, and the churches are designed for you to pray, to be in that space, mental space, where you are in an intimate relationship with something higher. And I thought that the Fremen will have the same thing. Their God is much more, let's say, Mother Nature. But there was something about this idea of keeping the intimacy as much as possible, and trying to create that proximity that I was trying to create with the film. Ron and I had some conversations about reverb, but it's a matter of taste. But I love the proximity and the intimacy. Dune, the novel, is a very intimate book. It's always seen from the perspective of the certain characters, that you have access to their inner thought, and this idea of intimacy, to be really close to them, to have space to hear their thought, let's say. Just by acting, or by that intimacy I was focusing on. And I tried to bring that with the sound as well with my friends.
Doug, I'd love to get your perspective on that. Sometimes these quiet spaces are actually some of the most difficult material to mix.
I think Denis hit the nail on the head. He has a way of saying a couple of words and we get it. We understand what he's trying to do. And intimacy is the word. I mean, to be able to be intimate with the actors and their performance, it works, and it was great leadership. And every day, I think this crew, the way we work is under Denis' leadership, is whatever we thought our best was yesterday, it's going to be better today. And we must be better every day.
It's a thing that Doug said that is that we developed very quickly a shorthand, a way to communicate that is we understand each other very quickly. We have if I can dare to say, we have a similar sensibility, I think. And there's something sometimes that I feel that the communication goes, and that for me is very rich. That's for me, it's a gift from life as a director to work with tremendous artists that also understand my limited English. But there's something there that for me is very, very precious to have that. It's gold when you feel that you don't have to over explain, that things are very fluid and there's a communal understanding. We work most of the time, we walk in the same direction. Very, spontaneously.
Clint, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. Obviously the score is a major element of the sonic experience of the film. Hans Zimmer, did another incredibly rich job scoring this film. I'd love for you to talk about the process of working with Hans, how you worked with these guys, bringing that music into the mixing environment, and sort of what was that back and forth? And were you on as well during the picture editorial period? Were you fitting stuff to Joe? Kind of walk us through that process.
I love working with these guys. I've Denis and Joe. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to be in there with those two from almost the beginning of the edit. And, like Denis was saying, Joe and he like to create a nice roadmap, and I get to help with that, which is a lovely challenge. And I get to use, and then Hans will provide us just some amazing tracks, as he always does. Just beautiful music, and richly layered and detailed. And we spend a lot of time going back and forth with Hans and his team, and really crafting. And then we have to really condense everything, but we have a great on the final. We just all of us have such. For me, it's one of the most fun experiences I ever every time we're on a dub, it's the most fun ever for me. We get so much detail, and to create something so emotionally moving and impactful, in the way that the music and the sound really are very, in order to make it work, they have to live so well together that it's just a lot of fun experimenting and trying to really help Denis achieve what he's going for emotionally and impactfully.
In the movie, what we are trying to, all the team together, is to try to find, if I may, Clint, to find a balance, the right balance between the of course, the music and the effects. And Hans, it can be very intrusive, and he gets very close to the limit of the sound design sometimes, and we love him for that. But Clint is one of the hero working in the shadow, where he managed to make sure that the music will blend, and there's something in this work that allows us to create that balance, working closely with Hans and choosing the right elements. Sometimes there's a lot of work that is done by Clint to make sure that everything goes together at the end.
On a practical level, like Richard, do you have sketches of Hans's score while you're working on sound design? Do you know what he's up to? I mean, I'm intrigued by this idea of like blending pieces, and sort of that the two live, the sound design and the score live in harmony with each other.
I had the blueprint, the sketch that Joe and Denis and Clint had done, and so I could see where Denis was thinking music would take the forefront, take the lead, and where sound effects would take the lead. That blueprint changed a little bit throughout, but the ideas were very strong from the beginning, and very, very bold decisions were made. And the sandworm ride is a good example of where sound effects can make the most impact and where music can make the most impact. It's like a textbook example. There was some experimentation about where to bring music in that scene and how to bring music in. Doug had a great idea of how to accomplish that in a dramatic way, not in a seamless way, but it makes a point when it comes in, and it comes in a very clever and powerful way.
So, as an audience member watching the film, my impression, now that I've seen that film like a few times now, my impression is that it's sound design all the way up to the moment when Paul gets up and he's able to stand, and then this big music comes in, and it's emotionally very satisfying. Do I have that right, or was it quite that seamless?
Yeah, that's basically it. There was one sound that he really loved that Hans did, this sort of an abstract sound design sound that he wanted to use early on in one very specific spot that he thought was very powerful. And you probably thought that was sound effects. But the idea for me with the worm ride was, I kept imagining, because I'm a sailor, sailing on a small boat in a storm, and things are just barely under control, and you're fighting against chaos and completely losing control. And the moment where Paul uh, he has the confidence and he feels that he is able to take control. In that moment where he feels like he's mastering this, is that moment where the music comes in, and you feel the 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 power of the music in that moment. And it's, to me, that it's that wedding, that melding of those two elements in that moment is just makes that scene so powerful. I love that scene.
Yeah, it's a scene that I will say it's a good example of sounds. We insisted to try to have sounds that will feel as natural. What really, how will sound a sandworm riding in rocks and sand? And there was ideas that Richard brought, which I love, because the idea that, nature is incredibly creative, and sometimes, just as an example, winter, the ice cracking, the sound of the ice that cracks at the beginning of winter or at the end of winter, those sounds are sci-fi sounds. They are like, you could not imagine that these sounds could exist coming out of the ice on a lake, on a frozen lake. And this idea that you have surprises like that in the nature, the way the worm hits the sand dune under Paul's feet, that sound, that is like, it doesn't sound like a monster. It sounds like a building that is bending or something. There's something about that sound that I was so excited about, because what I loved about it, it felt like natural, but massively surprising and fresh and original. But I believe that if a sandworm was hitting the sand dune under my feet, it will sound like that.
Ron and Doug, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that worm riding sequence, and sort of, because of course the danger with a sequence like that is that it could just become white noise after it's so full frequency. So talk about shaping that scene.
Well, again, thanks to Denis, that's a story within a story. So it starts out very silent, very quiet, and as the desert is, and we progress through Paul's story, what's happening. And earlier in the film, there was a shot of the worm coming up out of the sand, and Richard and Denis and I, we thought about that shot and just said, no, let's not overshoot this. Let's make it majestic, but not overpowering. So we saved some of that for the worm ride, which Ron can speak about. I just want to say my kids love that sequence.
Denis sets up that whole scene so well, and you just follow his lead, and it takes you in a unbelievable climax by the end when he stands up and rides it. But it starts with such tiny, small sounds of the footsteps or his breathing or the thumper, and all these things are all calculated and set up to bring you to that point. There's a lot of anticipation, and like Doug said, they held back the big burst that you see in the distance for that reason, because it would tip your hand. So when it does show up and plows through that sand, the dune, it's just like deafening, but they do it in such an artful way that they really tune the bottom end of the track, the low end. It's not just a bunch of subwoofer. It's very tuned, specific notes within it that make that stack up nicely in the spectrum of sound. So you're not just like, it's just, noisy and flabby. It's very tight, very specifically tuned sounds. And then as he bursts through and jumps, then it's true chaos where you don't know where you are. He's falling through space, sand everywhere, and then it gets a little surreal. And as it brings you up to where he's on the worm, we really went back and forth a lot about exactly what sounds of music we bring in, when they show up, when does the real peak happen? Is it when he starts to stand up, or is he already up? And we've been back and forth so many times to get it just right. And then we all kind of collectively went, that's it. We all loved it. So it was kind of a cool, very collective, group of people working in that one creative space that brings you to the same conclusion where we all loved it as audience members. So hopefully it translates, to you watching it the first time.
There's the beginning of the scene, this idea that the thumper will create a tension, and you hear that thumper, but you hear that thumper for quite a while. And there was something about the perspective of it to try to create an immersive feeling. And I absolutely love how Doug and Ron create that tension, that building tension, and really increasing the immersive feeling of the scene by the perspective you have on the thumper. And I remember having a discussion with Doug about the fact that technically there's a moment where you should hear the thumper, but you don't hear it anymore. Because the idea, Doug's idea was that now we have to focus on the worm coming. And I thought that was, for me, an absolute lesson into cinema hypnotism, where you feel that you still hear the thumper, but you don't hear it anymore. But it's about as I think Doug said at the beginning, how the sound mix drive your focus, the storytelling, just by moving the sounds like that. It's something that, so if you want the audience who could, it's interesting to see the dance of the thumper, how the perspective shifts, how many times it does, and what it creates as a tension and that feeling of being there for real. And I remember also that as Ron rightly said, it was like a storm, meaning too many elements. And I don't remember who came with the idea of, at one point when Paul finally is on the worm, we left the true big rumble and we just kept the wind, just being with him in the wind, the excitement of the speed. And that idea was phenomenal. And it's one of my favorite moments when finally he has his grip on the worm, stabilize the worm, he's just feeling the pressure of the air. And that's a beautiful use of sound design, I think.
Clint, I'd love to ask you about you guys are on the Dolby podcast, so of course I have to ask you about the way you use Dolby Atmos. Hans is a composer who has been very vocal about embracing Dolby Atmos from a musical perspective, and I love the way you guys are using the Atmos, the sonic field in Atmos for the score. Can you talk about your conversations with Hans about Dolby Atmos, about how you deliver that material to the stage, and about how you kind of position the elements around in the Atmos sound field?
Sure. I mean, it's pretty straight with Hans. It's pretty straightforward. I get a wealth of music, and a lot of it spread out. I just said as much of it separated as possible. Some very large sessions that I come to the stage with, as everyone can attest to. And but what it allows is, so I get this stuff from his mixer, Alan. It shows up, and Ron and I just get to have fun. I mean, mostly it's just Ron, and I just get to sit next to him and go, "Hey, that sounds really cool, Ron. Let's try something else." But it's having all of those elements. There's so much richness. There's so many different elements that were provided. And as Denis was saying, it's also helpful because then we can sort of pick and choose sometimes, decide what really is helping and what maybe is helping a little less, and really feature some stuff, really pull some of the really gold out of things that maybe might have been shadowed or otherwise. And then Ron is, I mean, the mixes speak for itself. What am I going to say?
But Alan Meyerson did a great job putting them all together, balancing it all with so many elements and putting his magic on it first. So when I get it, it's already really nicely balanced. But then we take it and spread it into Atmos and go nuts with it. And they have to listen to me soloing everything, going, and I'm like, oh boy, we'll be back in an hour. But it's a lot of fun because you're able to take so many different elements and almost all of them are separate or layers of separation in that way that we can then, separate as you go back into the theater and also as high as you want to go. But I promised Denis a long time ago on Blade Runner, the first day, because I promised I won't put something in the back. You go, what was that? So none of that, but we create and fill the space in a way that it allows you to wrap around you and really feel like you're in it. And I think that's the key is finding elements that are more ambient, if you will, or not as percussive, and those wrap around really nice or can bring a lot of height. I always love to play the choir elements like up high and in the back as if you're sitting in church and you hear the choir behind you. It's kind of that throwback to that, a little nod to church. And then also, percussive elements and all that are more up front and punchy, but it allows a lot of space for Doug and Richard to play because I've pulled a lot of sound back out into the room and away from the front three where they live a lot because they have so many things that are happening on screen that have to play. And so I give way to those, to allow more room for that to happen. So it's all about tone, level, and space, if you think of it that way. So I'm trying to stack sounds in the tone that fits like lows and highs and all that with Richard's sounds, and then pull back into the space and obviously level to coming and going with transitions and whatnot.
Denis, I'd love for you to talk about Dolby Atmos just a little bit. One of the things that really stood out for me in the film is I always love contrast and the way you use dynamics. But one of the sequences from an Atmos perspective that really stood out for me was drinking the water of life. That felt to me like a moment when things really open up and you're using the full sound. So I'd love for you to talk about that and the way you use Atmos in those moments.
What I absolutely love with Atmos is that it allows you to bring, like I will repeat what Ron said, that like a lot of power in the sound and keeping the intimacy, protecting the intimacy of the character. It's a very precise sound system that allows you to protect tiny details, and it's a good example, that scene where you have a character that will dive from a very intimate experience into some kind of surreal world, yes, and to increase that the impact of that, the Dolby Atmos was absolutely fantastic, because there's something about I love about Dolby Atmos is the idea that it's not something that distracts you or impress you from what's happening. It pulls you in the screen. It drags you toward the screen. It focuses you, increase your focus on the experience of what's happening on the screen. I remember when I began, I was a film. At my first film, old sound master from France, Jean-Pierre Laforce, told me, I'm not mixing, I'm mixing the image. I'm mixing the image. And I remember that the idea that the sound should never distract you from what's happening. It should push you in the image. It should and I feel that Atmos is the most powerful tool for that. And I feel that that scene specifically is a good example for that, to increase the surrealism experience of that woman that will fight a poison inside herself to protect her baby in her womb. That it's quite an abstract idea, and the sound does it.
Look, I cannot let you guys go without discussing the arena sequence on Gidi Prime and the big fight sequence between Feyd-Rautha and the Atreides guys. So there's so much. Look, we could talk for an hour just about that one sequence, which we can't do. So I just want to talk about some of the elements of it. Talk to me about the Harkonnen dialogue, all of that element. And we'll start there, and we'll kind of dig into the pieces of it. Richard, tell us about that particular element.
A lot of that was Dave Whitehead and Martin Kwok recording a huge amount of group, and Dave Bach did a lot as well here. They recorded like punk rock singers, heavy metal singers, people who could be very uninhibited in their vocalizations. And this is a planet of crazed madmen who are just looking for blood. They needed to be just at 11. And so we collected an enormous amount of material and picked the moments where we really heard that huge crowd, that huge bloodthirsty crowd. You can't play that for the entire scene. So there was a lot of trial and error to arrive at the right balance, the right mix of telling the story, setting the scene, and telling the story that takes place within that scene, and hearing all the dialogue. It's a very complex, sonically, a very complex scene.
Happy birthday, dear nephew.
Before we get into the dynamics of shaping the mix, Richard, maybe you could take an opportunity here. I know that you do a lot of pre-mixing as you're building tracks. That's mostly in 5.1 that you're 7.1. So tell me a little bit about kind of your pre-mixing process. Obviously, that means that you're able to make a lot of decisions before the material gets to the stage, but you're sending stuff to Denis and Joe Walker, so they're hearing it. I mean, the idea obviously is that you don't want them to hear things for the first time on the mixing stage, right?
Right. Yeah. The process of arriving at the right sounds is an evolution, and it was invaluable to have Denis' input and Joe's input throughout the editorial process. And mixing is a lot of what sound design is. I mean, the relationship of sounds to each other is a big part of what we do as sound people. And so I feel like I try to create a mix that for me tells the story that's being told, and with the impact that I feel like it should have. And then obviously that is modified enormously as we go through the mix process, and we get Denis' input and Ron and Doug and Clint all working together to fashion this. But I try to bring in something that, at least to me, sounds awesome, and from there we start making it awesomer.
Ron and Doug, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the battle sequence in the arena, because there's so much going on. You've got those creatures that are clicking and clacking, but it's all articulate. It's all in the track. But that was a lot of shaping for you to do to kind of arrive at a moment of clarity that we finally do.
Well, in absolute humility, I will say that when I first started mixing that sequence, I was very enamored of what Denis and Greg Fraser had done, and I started mixing it as a spectacle, and everybody just sort of went, Denis didn't say much, but I got it. I understood. And then I had to circle back to what's the story, what's going on here in the story. And I started remixing it based on that. And Denis, bless his heart, was sitting there and he said, I hear what you're doing, my friend, and I like it. But when I first started, I really did it badly.
Well, Doug, wait a second. Before you go off that thought, I'd love to dig into that for a second, because when you said you mixed it as a spectacle, did you feel like pressure to match the huge epic level of the visuals with the sound, or what do you mean by that, and how did you end up shaping it?
What I mean very specifically is I obscured the story.
No, but Doug is very humble, but it was like a lesson of sound mixing in front of our eyes, how the power of sound mixing, how you can reshape, change a perception of a scene in a very radical way. And it's true that at the beginning, and maybe myself, we wanted to put too much element, but then Doug shaped it and increasing the focus, like in a more intimate way, I will say. I mean, it's still grandiose, but having a much more shaped approach. It was really a real privilege to see him going back and attacking and seeing the smoke coming out of his ears. Trying to so he took that as a challenge. I love that.
It's like having a wealth of too many great things at once, and it's just cacophonous and huge, and yeah, it's like daunting. Like, where do we start? And you really just have to go, moment by moment with the story. Like, what's happening? Well, Baron comes out. We want this badass music going with Hans, absolutely. So we back off the crowds and the PA and whatnot. And as soon as we get out to the crowds, Doug, opens it up so nicely, and you hear the PA guy really getting on the mic, and it's just angry. And you set up how sweaty and awful that must be in that place, and just, raucous of these crazy people just chanting in this weird language, and it's disorienting. And like, where are we? What's going on? It's shot beautifully with that infrared. It's just such a cool look. And so we kind of delved into that and said, okay, what can we do with this? And we have to really make bold push and pulls with stuff. Like when Fade walks out, he's a rock star. So we just land hard with Hans's guitars and all that and make him like a rock star. And then the crowd reacts to that. So it's always a give and a take, and, push pull like that through the whole scene. And the most dramatic one is when he finally stabs him, and he whispers this line, and we're already at, 12. So we had to find an artful way of like bringing this down to hear the whisper, which brought us to a really cool, trope of like, oh, let's just yank the rug out for the audience. And you go, like that. And you went from this huge sound to nothing. And he whispers the line, you fought well, Atreides. And then it just, bam, it opens back up again. And that's so impactful. But we had to do it, out of necessity to hear the line. But it was such a cool way to get in and out of that. It was great.
Stay back! You fought well, Atreides. Impressive indeed.
I just wanted to add the idea that Doug and Ron really shaped this dialogue between the crowd and Fade, this relationship that, and I think that when Doug came back, he shaped that, he focused on that. Instead of having the show, it was more like that kind of dialogue between the crowd, and that created the power to the scene.
It's remarkable. Yeah, I love the way you shape the dynamics of it. We could talk about these huge sequences all day long. We haven't even talked about the climax of the film. But I got to say, one of my favorite sound moments in Dune Part 2 is a fairly quiet one. It's that scene, sort of kind of one of the next scenes after the big arena scene between Fade Rotha and Lady Margot Fenrig in the palace, when she kind of is seducing him in that forbidden zone in the palace. I love that sequence and the way you handle the dialogue and the treatment of it in that space and the ambiances. I thought it was just a remarkable sequence. I'd love for you guys to talk about that and what the approach was to that particular scene.
It was so cool. I mean, the way Denis set it all up, and it's a dance with this like snake charmer thing, and she's just gonna go in and take him out, and he has no idea it's happening to him, kind of vibe. And it was really cool. So, obviously they're in this very reverberant space, and it's hard walls and all that. So we set that up to like, okay, we're cool. And then as she starts, spinning her web, if you will, it just goes so dry that you're whispering in your ear kind of feel. And it's just like creepy because she's in his head. And then we use that, to help propel that story. And then as she goes away from him again, it's this cool like delay and reverb that you're just kind of like dreamy and you get sucked into it like a hypnotic feeling. And then she pulls him in and he goes, put your hand on the box, and it's dry again. You're like, ah. So it's very fun to play with that. And you rarely get a chance to do that. So hats off, my friend, for letting us play that hard with that.
Hats off to you.
Denis, I'll ask you, sometimes when we have these conversations, I love to ask the director, what's your favorite sound moment in the film? Maybe just a moment that kind of every time you end up watching the film, maybe fills you with a little bit of joy when that sequence kind of goes through the film, which is sort of one particular moment that stands out.
I love also the tiny sounds in the desert. There's something that I love in the book is the idea of Frank Herbert created an ecosystem, a fake ecosystem. But when you read the book, all the names of the bird, the insect, the little animals that survive in the desert, it feels so real. And I had asked Richard to try to bring alien sounds that feels so close to our own, from that it will not shock our psyche, that we will believe that that could be a mouse or that could be some insects. So all those natural sounds that are coming from this desert at night, I really love.
Thomas.
You sandwalk like a drunk lizard.
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good so far.
Yeah, well, you're not even in worm territory yet.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I had written a note to myself. Like I just always thought of Arrakis as this sort of lifeless desert planet, but I love those sequences at twilight and at nighttime in the desert. And you really made it come alive with animal sounds. Richard, what is that real stuff that you gathered, or what's comprising all those moments?
They're not far from terrestrial animals, but they're not terrestrial animals. And Denis' idea was that in the day, it's incredibly hot. The desert is very quiet, very, very quiet. We hear wind, but it's desolate. At night, the critters come out. And he wanted them to sound mysterious, maybe just a tiny bit menacing, but also beautiful. And I think we achieved that. I love that sequence too. To me, it's just magical.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you about Dune Part 2. It's a remarkable film, Denis. Once again, congratulations, and it's.
Thank you, Glenn. But it's for me, making films at the end of the day, it's a collective process. It's the chance to work with artists like this gentleman here, and I'm just a blessed French Canadian to have the chance to work with those masters. Voilà, that's how I would end it.
Many thanks to Denis, Doug, Richard, Ron, and Clint for joining us on the podcast today. And an extra special thanks to our friends at Warner Brothers for helping us put this conversation together. Be sure to check out Dune Part 2, now streaming in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos on Max. There are links, as always, in our show notes. And if you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers about how they use technology to tell their stories, be sure you are subscribed to Dolby Creator Talks. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube, in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're curious to know more about what we do at Dolby Creator Lab, head on over to dolbycreatorlab.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of the show, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining us.